It's 2022. We have record high gas prices. Inflation is at an all-time high since the 1980s and at 7%. We got a war going on in Ukraine. COVID is somehow still here, and it's only March. Man, it's starting off to be a great year. But that brings the question, do you need an emergency fund? Now, before we hop into answer, do you need an emergency fund? We need to explain what an emergency fund is. An emergency fund is money set aside for an emergency. Exactly that, an emergency fund. What does that mean? That means you have money that you're not going to touch unless an emergency happens. Starbucks ain't an emergency, guys. Fast food, it's not an emergency. Car broke down, that's an emergency. Flat tire, that's an emergency. House caught on fire, that's a real emergency. All right, but how much should you have if you have an emergency fund? Have 3 to 6 months of base living expenses. I'm talking about base. I'm talking about what do you need for your house payment? What do you need to keep the lights on? What do you need to keep the water going? What do you need to keep your car? What do you need for your car insurance? Base expenses. Also, the money in your emergency fund should be kept in cash or in a debit card. And this cash or debit card should be kept in a safe or should be kept outside of your wallet. So you just don't happen to spend it when you're out on your day and you see something you like and you just have the card there and swipe it. Now, some people say, should we have a credit card? Should a credit card be used? No, I'm going to answer that now. A credit card should not be an emergency fund. A credit card is not an emergency fund. A credit card should never be included when talking about an emergency fund. Now, I'm going to do a video on that later because that's a whole topic on itself. Now that we've answered the base question on what an emergency fund is, now I'm going to give you the first reason on why you need one. And the first reason is you need to feel secure and safe at your house. The only way to do that is knowing you have money to handle an emergency if it happens. And then usually shortly after that, we're like, nothing's ever going to happen to me. I'm good. I'm fine. I've been fine the past 20 years. Nothing's happened. I don't need an emergency fund. I'm ready. I can handle stuff on the fly. And then it hits you. You're not ready and you have an emergency. And your emergency fund is nowhere near it should be because you had the same thing that I was just talking about. Now, the real question is not if an emergency happens to you, it's when something will happen to you that's an emergency. Now, what an emergency fund doesn't do is it doesn't handle the emergency. Of course, an emergency fund isn't gonna, if your house burns down, just an emergency fund isn't gonna bring it back to brand new, isn't gonna bring it back to prior days. If your car breaks down or you get in a car accident, that's not gonna make you whole. It's not gonna bring your car back from the graveyard. But what it does do is it buys you time. And time is essential when an emergency happens. If you have time, you're not going to panic and stress because you can calmly think of ways that you can handle it, multiple ways instead of just one. If you have an emergency fund, it's going to cause a lot less stress. All right, that brings us to reason number 2, stress. Stress ruins a lot, if not everything. Stress ruins marriages, it ruins relationships, it causes obesity. Stress does a lot of damage to everything. And the main cause of stress is money problems. So if you can just solve the money aspect, the amount of stress you can save when an emergency happens is immense. Just remember, money can't buy happiness, but money can buy freedom. Guys, just remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you like what I'm talking about right now. And we're going to go ahead and move on to reason number 3, budgeting. An emergency fund is the start of the budgeting process. Because in order to have an emergency fund, in order to start putting money aside, you need to know where your money's going. And when you start knowing where your money's going, you're starting the budgeting process. Starting the budgeting process is also starting the process of becoming financially free. Because you're now knowing where your money's going. You're starting to track what you need to buy, what you're buying, and what you need to cut because you're spending way too much money. These 3 reasons are the reason you need to have an emergency fund. Like I said, the first reason is because you need to become financially stable. Having an emergency fund gives you that financial stable feeling, gives you that financial freedom feeling that you're not worried if an emergency happens. Reason number 2 is the stress. The stress that having financial problems or that an emergency brings can be completely avoided if you have time to deal with it. And money buys time. And number 3, of course, is budgeting. Starting an emergency fund begins the process of budgeting, which begins the process of becoming financially free. So it's a win-win all around. Now, if you're saying I'm already budgeting, I don't have any money left aside to put toward an emergency fund, then you need to go ahead and watch our video on how to make more money in 2022.